Hey, we're finishing up the Chapter 9 PowerPoint presentation, the Chapter 9 slides. And half of the chapter that we didn't talk about is government policies. So we talked about how when we trade with other countries, it increases total surplus, meaning total well-being to buyers and sellers. But when we're exporting, um, when the world price is higher than our domestic price and we open up the borders to trade, this mainly benefits sellers from this country and it hurts buyers. And when the world price is lower than the domestic price, opening up to trade imports, it helps buyers but hurts sellers. And sometimes this creates a situation where, we're hurting sellers to the point where people are losing their jobs and people are lobbying the government. Please do something about this. People are buying too many imported cars or imported toys or whatever the item might be. And one government response is to put a tariff on imported goods, which is a tax on goods that are produced elsewhere and sold in this country. So, for example, if there were a tariff on imported cars, anytime you wanted to buy a Toyota or an Audi, something produced in another country, you'd have to pay a tax on that item. All right, so tariffs raise the price of imported goods above the world price by the amount of the tariff. All right, so whatever that tax is, the government's forcing you to pay that extra price amount on top of the price. So let's see how that looks in a sketch. All right. So you can see that the world price is less than this country's equilibrium price without trade. All right. The world price is this blue line down here. And if we just allow trade with countries and that becomes the price, then you can see we only have a few domestic sellers that are willing to sell for that low price, but we have a lot of domestic buyers that want to buy for that low price. The difference between those two numbers is the amount of imports. All right? But if we raise the price, we effectively raise the price of imported goods by imposing a tariff, we're looking at this. All right? This tariff increases the price to consumers. So now, this becomes the price that you have to pay if you want to buy this good in this country. So we've reduced the number of willing buyers, but we've increased the number of sellers. There's this many sellers that say, oh, I'll sell if I can get this much. If this is the price that people are paying for imported goods, well, I can match that price and I'll sell domestic goods. So we've increased the number of sellers. We've decreased the number of buyers. All right, let's see what's going to happen here. So before the tariff, this is what we've been talking about last week and a little bit the week before. This is producer surplus. All right, not much, but consumer surplus is very large because we're getting these buyers are getting a lower price. This triangle represents surplus that didn't exist without trade. Without trade, this is consumer surplus, and all this is producer surplus, all this. All right, but with trade, and this triangle didn't exist, all right? So this is new surplus. In this case, it's consumer surplus, but this is surplus that didn't exist without trade. All right, let's see what happens when we put a tariff or a tax on these imported. All right, so all of a sudden, we've increased producer surplus. Producer surplus used to be down here. Now it's this much. So the tariff accomplished part of what it wanted to accomplish. It wanted to help domestic sellers, and it did. All right, but it also hurt domestic buyers. Here's what else it did. it created tax revenue, or it created government revenue. All right. So the amount of the tariff, this is the amount of imports now from here to here. All right. So this many imported units times the amount of the tax, this becomes government revenue or tax revenue. Yep, I can spell. Tax revenue. All right, and that counts as total surplus because tax revenue, in theory, is, in theory, there's no waste. The tax revenue goes directly towards serving the population. Everything the government does with tax revenue, schools, roads, regulation on drugs, Food and Drug Agency, all the stuff that the government does, court systems. So all this goes back to society. So that counts as total surplus. But what's gone now is these two little white triangles, and this is deadweight loss. All right, this is lost surplus that would have existed without the tariff. All right, so that's lost economic activity. All right. So the economists would like to see, even though we've helped sellers in this country and we've created tax revenue for the government, we've decreased total surplus by imposing this tariff. All right, so this is what we just talked about. Producer surplus after the tariff. It increases. It was G, now it's G plus C. There's your tariff revenue. That goes back to society. But those two red triangles, that's lost surplus. That's deadweight loss. All right, and consumer surplus would have been A, B, C, D, E, F. Without the tariff, now it's just A and B. We got this nice little chart. You can see these slides. They're attached to your work for today. And so a tariff reduces the quantity of imports, and it moves the domestic market closer to its equilibrium without trade. With a tariff, total surplus decreases, and that amount is referred to as deadweight loss. There's another way the government could choose to help domestic sellers if we feel there's a problem with importing too many goods. And this part won't be on the test, but I'm going to run through it real quickly. An import quota. All right, so it's limiting the number of imported cars, let's say, that can be sold within the country. All right, and what happens is the government gives licenses to a certain number of sellers who can buy these goods at the world price and sell it at the higher domestic price. All right, let's take a look at what this looks like. All right, so here's domestic demand. Okay, here's domestic supply. Here's the price that would have existed if there was no trade with the world. All right, but now we're allowing a certain amount of trade. We're not just opening up the borders. If we did, we'd have all this amount of imports. But we're giving licenses to a certain number of sellers in this country to go buy imported products and sell them here. So that shifts supply, all right, because now it's domestic supply plus imported supply, and that creates a higher price than the world price. It's lower than price without any kind of interaction with the world, but it's a higher price. So again, we've got a similar situation. We do have deadweight loss. You'll see this. Well, let's take a look. Oh, boy. All right. So this rectangle, instead of tax revenue for the government or tariff revenue, this becomes extra surplus to people that have a license to sell imported goods. All right. We've increased producer surplus, just like with the tariff, from G to G plus C. We've cut consumer surplus back to A plus B. This is still surplus to society, and this is still deadweight loss. Now, what happens also is the government could sell import licenses. So these companies that are allowed to buy imported goods and sell them domestically, they buy a license from the government. So this ends up being just government revenue again, just like with the tariff. All right. So the main idea here is quotas and tariffs. They do help domestic sellers, which is what they're intended to do, but they also cut back on economic activity and create deadweight loss. So economists feel that the government should just let trade happen. All right, so with the quota, total surplus decreases. The amount is called deadweight loss. And if there's lobbying involved as to who gets the import licenses, it could even enhance the problem of deadweight loss. And this is what we just talked about. If the government sells its import licenses, then that little rectangle on the graph becomes government revenue. And so the effects of a tariff and a quota end up looking identical. Both tariffs and import quotas raise domestic prices. They raise the price the consumer has to pay. They reduce the welfare of buyers. They increase the welfare of sellers. They both cause deadweight losses. Other reasons, arguments for international trade: increased variety of goods, lower costs through economies of scale because of opportunity cost and comparative advantage, increased competition, and enhanced flow of ideas. All right. Arguments for restricting trade: people are losing jobs. We want to save jobs. National security argument: what if we were importing all of our military planes and all of a sudden there's war and the country that was supplying our planes isn't going to sell us planes anymore? Now there's a national security argument. We should be making planes in the U.S. so we don't rely on anybody else. Infant industry argument: let's say there's a industry that's just starting. Let's say the U.S. is just starting to create good toys. There's some companies up and coming, and we don't want to have the cheap toys from China competing with them. We want to allow this industry a chance to get on its own 2 feet. So we're going to put a tariff or a quota on imported toys for a while. Unfair competition: you could say that being able to buy toys from China, maybe they're using underage workers and it's unfair competition. Protection as a bargaining chip argument: when people get into politics and bargaining for protection for certain industries in exchange for money to campaigns and stuff like that, I assume is what we're talking about here. All right. Here's some language that you don't have to know for the test, but you should have to know for everyday life. When a country removes trade restrictions on its own, doesn't care what other countries are doing, that's called a unilateral decision. If a country gets together and mutually reduces trade restrictions with other countries, that's called a multilateral decision. Here's a famous one from history. The North American Free Trade Agreement was an example of a multilateral trade agreement in the early 1990s. This was an agreement between United States, Mexico, and Canada to lower trade barriers and increase imports and exports amongst these countries. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade refers to a continuing series of negotiations among many of the world's countries with a goal of promoting free trade. They've successfully reduced the average tariff among member countries from about 40% after World War II to only about 5% today. So, to summarize this chapter, the effects of free trade can be determined by comparing domestic price without trade to the world price. A low domestic price indicates that you've got a comparative advantage in producing the good, and if you open up your borders to trade, you'll be exporting goods to sell at the higher price out there in the world. A higher domestic price means that the world price is lower than yours. Other countries have a comparative advantage in producing the good. So if you open up to trade, you'll be importing these goods. When a country allows trade and becomes an exporter, sellers are better off, buyers are worse off. When you allow trade and become an importer, buyers are better off and sellers are worse off. But we know that one of the main points here is that the losses to one party are outweighed by the gains to the other party. In other words, the gains to sellers outweigh the losses to buyers, or vice versa. A tariff, a tax on imports, moves a market closer to equilibrium that would have been without trade, and therefore it reduces the gains from trade. And import quotas have similar effects. All right, there are various arguments for restricting trade, protecting jobs, defending national security, helping infant industries, meaning new industries, preventing unfair competition, and responding to foreign trade restrictions. Well, that's what they were talking about. So you let up your tariff on automobiles, and we'll let up our tariff on poultry. All right, so when you're making a deal with another country. Economists, however, believe that free trade is usually the better policy. And that's it. Now try some problems.